the Vermont WILPF gathering, and we're very delighted that Elizabeth Shackelford can join us, though she's just a couple of miles away in Rochester, Vermont. And the rest of the people from the gathering are scattered around, but when they want to ask a question, you have to come up and ask it here so that we will get your voice, okay? So, very good. Yeah, so to introduce Elizabeth a little bit, this is the Descent channel, and she has it also, and you all can see it. She has a dramatic story to tell of serving in the State Department in South Sudan and seeing the chaos unfurling there as soon as they got independence, and the president and the vice president started to disagree with each other, and then it was right during the time that that the war started in 2013. So I emailed to everyone her recent statement in Ms. Magazine, and I think it's very interesting. I hope you've read it, sort of explaining why she quit and actually inviting other people to consider quitting the Trump administration. If you watch the news recently, someone did just quit. So I think she may be the beginning of the avalanche of people speaking truth to power and saying, you know, this, what's going on. To start with Elizabeth, is to save that discussion for towards the end and ask sort of the basic question: why were you so interested in the State Department to go to South Sudan, since it was hardly a country. It's been a country since 2011. And as I understand it, you didn't get sent there originally, but you finally were there. You were attracted to go there.
Yes, well, I mean, that was exactly the reason I wanted to go, because it was such a unique situation. I mean, when I first joined the Foreign Service, it was, you know, out of that sense that the United States government had a really positive role to play in the world. So I will admit up front, I was rather naive. But the idea for me was that if there was a place that we could get it right, you know, kind of using our democracy and our human rights background that we purported to believe in, this small new country where we poured a tremendous amount of money, relatively speaking, and political influence was really the place we could do it. So my thought was, if we can't do it in South Sudan, if we can't have a positive influence there, where can we? So that's what drove my decision to go there.
And why do you think the United States poured so much money into South Sudan? In other words, what were the forces behind the government, behind what was going on there, namely the Christian divide with Muslims? It's mainly a Christian country in Africa.
So it's interesting because Africa, typically speaking, gets ignored largely in our foreign policy. And South Sudan was really an example for that. And there were several factors that kind of poured in together, creating a kind of a perfect storm for high-level U.S. interest. One was, you know, this kind of simple good versus evil story that a lot of advocates have built around it, which was, you know, Sudan is the Muslim north, it's bad, Khartoum is bad, and, you know, the South are just these Christian people trying to get, you know, freedom against this oppressive government. So it seemed like a very kind of simple, cut and dry story for people to get behind, and the lobbying effort in Congress was huge. And it was a combination of your human rights advocates who really wanted to end this, you know, kind of longest standing African civil war, and the kind of strong Christian evangelicals who were pushing for action for this, you know, Christian movement as they saw it. And that all tied in with this particular timing. Yeah. Can you hear me, Robin?
Oh, yeah, yeah, sorry. I interrupted
Sorry.
just to say that, as I understand it, a lot of African American evangelical people were totally behind
Yeah,
this new
it was
country and
a
forming this
big
new country.
push. Right. In fact, there was probably more interest in the United States evangelical movement for independence than you had in some pockets of the South Sudanese society. And that all lined up with this interest at the time of the U.S. government in being very anti-Khartoum, so anti-Sudan, which came along with a lot of our counterterrorism efforts. This was that movement really came pre 9/11 and then went into it, but Osama bin Laden was parked out for years in Khartoum and had really close ties to Sudan as well. So those different forces just aligned, and it created this perfect storm of a huge, tremendous amount of US foreign policy interest in a country that wouldn't have otherwise gotten it, for better or for worse.
Mm. We had 18 of the young, what do they call it, the lost boys, 18 young lost, lived here, married here, went to college here, and many of them went back and tried to start colleges or start high schools, work in high schools and so on. And I'm afraid, their dreams have been crushed by what has happened. Could you tell us about some of the other forces at play there in South Sudan? Some of the returnees, Sudanese files coming back to try to make things good?
Yeah, it's actually a real a horrible part of the story I remember so well in the early days of the war in 2013, talking to different friends and colleagues and contacts of mine who had returned after independence, with exactly that hope. I mean, I had our political assistant in the embassy, who was a brilliant South Sudanese American who had, like so many other South Sudanese children, walked out on foot, ended up a refugee in the United States, became an American citizen, and traveled back to help his country. And that was a huge tragedy, because you saw this big move of folks who had been educated and came back after all that hardship, and to watch them see their country descend again into civil war was one of the most heartbreaking parts of it. But I will say the dynamics on the inside were interesting and difficult, because you had the people who had in power, who had stayed throughout all of the wars, who had not left, who had not been educated overseas. And so there was always this kind of dynamic between them and the returnees of this idea, well, you left, you went somewhere comfortable, you got an education, and now you came back and you want to you want to have a position of power or authority. So there were definitely some issues between those two sets of the population, and I think sometimes it did make it harder for people who were coming back with some really strong skill sets and just dedication to it to overcome the fact that they left. But even more so, it was really hard to come back in with good intentions and just face this incredibly corrupt kind of political economic system that had developed there during the war. I mean, war economies are always pretty corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. It looks like we have a question here.
Yeah.
Can you get in the image? Map.
Yeah, good. Okay, I guess my name is Sandy, and I'm a colleague of Robin's. I'm wondering what when you say Civil War, what were the reasons for the Civil War? I guess the South Sudan seceded from the North. Is that true? Is that correct?
No, it actually didn't secede. There were two civil wars fought, over the course of a few decades, basically ever since independence from British colonialism. South Sudan did ultimately win its independence, but it was not initially a war of secession. It was initially a war for equal rights for the Southerners, because you did have these big differences between, you can look at the entire African continent, you can look kind of across here, and there is, I forget exactly, it's like the 14th parallel, or there's this line that basically goes across Africa, where you're separating kind of your northern African feel from your sub-Saharan African feel. You have very different communities, you know, kind of more pastoralist versus more agriculturalist. It's very different. And so you have communities that have fought, and you can look at conflicts across the continent. They go across through kind of this same level. There are climate issues involved. There are, you know, natural resource issues involved. But you had a lot of conflict, and you had these different types of communities, the North African versus kind of the sub-Saharan African cultures as well. Some of this was religious. You know, there were differences that way. A lot of it was ethnic. But the fight really was for and language as well. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. So you have all of these differences. And in the case of Sudan, like with many other places, the post-colonial border that was drawn around it just really did not account for the differences of communities that were in there. So that's where a lot of the natural conflict came. But one of the interesting factors that people don't often know is that in the Sudanese civil wars, before South Sudan's independence, there was just as much fighting between Southerners, different Southern groups, and between the North and the South. So there were several wars going on. So you had a big push within the Southerners. You did have folks who were pushing for secession from an early stage, but it was definitely not kind of a given at the time of the end of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. In fact, for those who know, follow anything about kind of Sudanese and South Sudanese history, John Garang was kind of considered the founding father of South Sudan. He was the leader of the kind of Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, early on. He kind of established it, but he was killed mysteriously in a helicopter crash, just right within like weeks of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement being signed. He was committed to a unified and equal Sudan. He was not a supporter of the idea of secession. But with his death, the powers who were really influential and really pushing for secession in a separate country, it was really only came about as kind of the inevitable after his death. So it's a little like all conflicts, it's more complicated than it looks at first glance.
But in the North, were they Arabic speaking in the North?
Yes.
And in the South?
Well, you have numerous languages, and Juba Arabic was kind of their lingua franca around Juba, around the capital, but you really didn't have a unifying language for the Southerners outside of Arabic, which is why so many people were using that kind of as the common tongue. But also interesting, when you say Southerners, there are lots of Southerners and still are in the North. There are lots of kind of African, kind of sub-Saharan African ethnic groups that live amongst the more Arabic communities in the North. So it's not really a straight line. You look at Darfur, I mean, it goes all the way much further north, and they're much more kind of related to the Southerners, if you will.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, she had questions.
Yeah. So, all right. Another question here.
We need to dump the water out.
And I just wanted to ask you, since I didn't read your book, what was your role actually in the State Department? What were your tasks?
Well, I was a Foreign Service officer, so I was kind of your standard, civil servant who came in through the, kind of the long process of becoming a Foreign Service officer. So I was actually pretty junior when I went to South Sudan. I was the deputy political officer and the consular officer. We had a very small mission. We were horribly understaffed. And so I held basically kind of 2.5 jobs as a second tour officer. So my jobs in South Sudan were primarily, I was covering human rights issues. So I was tracking and reporting on human rights issues in the country. And I was also our entire consular section. I was our only American consular officer. Consular affairs is basically dealing with, in a lot of countries, you deal with visas and you deal with American citizen services. We weren't issuing visas, so I dealt with a lot of American citizen emergencies there. So if someone dies, gets sick, gets arrested, or let's say, for example, a war breaks out and you have to evacuate 1,100 people, that was all within my purview.
Yeah.
So when you talk about human rights, what role did the United States actually take with human rights issues? Because all through Africa, there are many human rights issues where the US has a mission and there is not really a in human rights. What action the government?
Well, that's a very interesting part of her book, because that was her role, to pay attention to that. And she wrote many dispatches up to Washington. And well, you can tell us what happened.
Yeah, what happened with your dispatches?
Well, so the interesting thing that you might not, a lot of people don't realize the United States government has human rights officers assigned in pretty much every embassy we have around the world. Now, it might not always be your full job, and as it was in South Sudan, it was one of two hats that I wore. But part of our job, kind of a core standard part, is that the US Congress passed a law a number of years ago that requires us to do an annual human rights report on every country in the world, except for ours, of course. That's a separate issue. But so a big part of it is basically you're annually tracking and updating this big human rights report. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually, it's a really important part of tracking not only kind of incidents that have happened, but what that government has done to address them. So let's say every year when you have, like I was actually working on a very early report, because of course the country was quite new, but I would be looking at the cases of human rights abuses, arresting and harassing journalists, individuals who had disappeared. And we would follow up the following year and say, okay, this happened last year. We've been tracking it. What has the government done? It's not, a huge part of our diplomacy in a lot of countries, but I will say we harass governments and speak to them about human rights offenses far more often than I think most Americans, understand. So one of the things that I did, I wrote these cables, these reports that went back to Washington to talk about the deteriorating situation for human rights. In South Sudan, when I first arrived, there were a lot of attacks between kind of government-supported militias in an area called Jonglei State. So that was the area that we were focusing on. And then, of course, as we got closer to the war, there was a shutdown in political freedoms and freedom of speech, attacks on journalists and things like that. And then when the war broke out, I was literally writing the reports back to Washington with testimonials explaining to Washington about ethnic cleansing that was being conducted by government forces. The human rights report that we put out, that I drafted, that went out in, I want to say it was March. So the war broke out in December and we put it out in March. That was the first report that had detailed a lot of what had happened in the kind of the first 10 days or so of the war. So it did a lot to highlight what was happening with real detail and evidence and background. In terms of how that influenced what we did as a country in our relations with South Sudan, I would encourage you to read my book, but that's where I talk about, how we knew this information, but we did not let it effectively change our position towards the government in the first couple of years of the war, which was very disappointing.
Well, that brings me to the second part of my question is, what are the natural resources of Sudan and why were we involved in Sudan besides so-called human rights? What were our trade agreements with Sudan?
Oh, we had no functional trade agreements with South Sudan. I mean, it's interesting because people always jump to the fact that we must have been there for the oil. And they do have oil, but it's really poor quality. It's very hard to get out of the ground. And it's in an incredibly dangerous place. And there's not much interest by American companies in the oil there. Generally speaking, the United States goes on to autopilot with a lot of countries in our kind of economic engagements. So let's say several months after I arrived, we were working on trying to promote our first, basically it was just a trade promotion activity, a conference with the South Sudanese. And that was an attempt to kind of invite business engagement between the two countries. We are not earning any money off of our partnerships in South Sudan. So it is not out of economic interest or extraction there. But it is a big point of interest for countries like China, which owns a lot of the areas and controls, has a lot of oil interest in the country. So that is something that is a major factor for some of the countries involved. But I'll just put it this way, it's a hell of a lot easier for us to get oil out of many, many, many more countries than South Sudan. And there are some other resources that, you know, American businesses might ultimately be interested in, but oil is really the country gets about 98% of its kind of GDP and government support out of oil.
So would you say then that our position in Sudan, our interest is really a geopolitical positioning within Africa?
You know, I will say, and I know there are a lot of people who are going to think that this is, you know, a naive position, but our national security interest was basically being a counterpoint to Khartoum, to Sudan. This was a thorn in the side of Sudan. We didn't like Sudan, so we were going to support the South. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. But the real reason that we leveraged so much money and funding was because the lobbying of the evangelical Christians was just really huge, and they were able to get people on board, you know, in Congress with this story that seemed very, very persuasive. That worked for several years, and it looked to be a really one of these very few success stories that we had in foreign policy on the African continent. So, you know, it didn't seem like it was a hard place to have a positive story. The problem became when we had supported this government in the South, and we had decided that they were the good guys and that Khartoum was the bad guys. When it became completely evident that the guys we were supporting in the South were, in fact, also bad guys, we were really reticent to change our position on them. And so that's where our foreign policy went really wrong on South Sudan. We refused to hold our friendly government there to account when it continued to, you know, commit really bad acts against its own people. So for me, the human rights failure there is not, you know, that we failed to get involved in a human rights issue. We did get involved in the human rights issue, and the human rights issue we were focused on was this, you know, oppressive war by the North against the Southern people. What we failed to do was recognize that the good guys we had chosen were not good guys anymore.
Like elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, so the who haven't read the book is that the guy who died by helicopter, who had a vision for keeping the Sudan together, his two lieutenants became president and vice president of South Sudan, and that lasted for a little while, and then they pulled apart and started the war, essentially, and it's still going on. I saw in the headlines just recently that Kiir refused to accept, or maybe it was the other way around, from the vice president, and it's mainly a tribal war now. Wouldn't you say?
Well, I mean, that's how it's playing out, but you know, you have to be cautious about calling it a tribal war because it's like all wars, it's a power war. And tribalism is really being used as a you know, a battle cry for these different groups, because when you live in a place that has not had a functional government for dozens of years, then, you know, the people look to their clan, their tribe, their immediate community for their protection and for support. And so it becomes a very easy thing to exploit. But if you look at the beginning of the war in South Sudan, it was very much a Dinka-led kind of, the administration's support was primarily Dinka, and its fighters were primarily Dinka. But on the other side, initially, you had kind of a pretty wide-ranging group of people in the opposition. At this point, it has really divulged to, you know, different groups with their different, you know, kind of mostly ethnically based militaries. But you know, that's the reality in a lot of these places, not because there's some natural animosity, but because it is something that is very easy a tool for these people in power to manipulate.
Yeah. All right, Charlotte has a question.
Yeah, hi there.
Sorry.
Hi. My father died in a plane crash right after World War II. He was stationed in Beirut, and I've spent years trying to figure out why he would be going from Saudi Arabia to Ethiopia. And in that case, the issue was all But my question is this, what do you think American overall strategy is for Africa? And you mentioned China, which I suspect that's a big one. Would you say a lot of it is what I call the great game? There are players in there and they're all fighting to get theirs or to get geostrategic positioning.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's in a nutshell. There are two major focal points in the real politic that is our foreign policy on the African continent. There's counterterrorism, which is a big issue in both in West Africa and in the Horn of Africa. And we have concerns about it writ large throughout the continent. And there is the great powers game and the growing influence of China, and also to a certain extent, Russia on the continent. That is where our primary concern comes in, which is one of the reasons it's so funny that South Sudan was able to corner so much of our focus and so much of our funding for the continent. It was not a counterterrorism issue other than the fact that we were anti-Sudan. And it's really not, I mean, it's not a strategic place. You look somewhere like Somalia, it's incredibly strategic because of the water pathways that go around it, because of the access that it has to, towards the Gulf and the Middle East. South Sudan does not have that kind of strategic interest for us. But I will say that China has put far more interest in South Sudan than from kind of economic interest. And it's actually the first place that China has deployed peacekeepers as part of, kind of a peacekeeping effort. So they did that a few years ago, and it really showed a shift in China's approach to the continent. But right now, when you're looking at the continent writ large, I think it's problematic because it leads us to feel as though we need a bigger military footprint, because we see China and we see Russia starting to put their military footprint on the ground. We already have more than anybody else does. I mean, on Africa, in just about anywhere. But we've seen China open their kind of first overseas military base in Djibouti. We've seen Russia start to do a lot of military training in other parts of the country. My personal thought is let them do it, because our military footprint is not something we are getting much bang for our buck on. Frankly, our military footprint in lots of parts of the continent are feeding into extremist ideology of the idea that America is this, kind of great oppressor that's moving into their countries. And I don't think we're doing a great job on that. But it will continue to be, China writ large is going to continue to be the reason we're looking so closely at expanding more in Africa.
Yeah, well, I looked up AFRICOM. AFRICOM is the American military command in Africa, and our government is in 53 African countries, and the town of Djibouti, which is the smallest country in all of Africa, is the headquarters of the one permanent base in Africa, and it's there's a Chinese base, a French base, an Italian base, and even a Japanese presence there. I bring it up partly because if you Google women in Djibouti, you will be led to an article called Warfare and Sexual Violence in Djibouti, written by a WILPF member who's head of our Reaching Critical Will, named Ray. It's the amount of trafficking, prostitution, is amazing. Yeah.
You need to repeat the name of the article because it got cut off. Your connection is not good.
The article by Ray Atchison is Remote Warfare and Sexual Violence in Djibouti. And everyone should try to find out where Djibouti is. It's right at the bottom, changes into the port of Aden, I think. Were you there, Elizabeth? Did you pass through Djibouti while you were in Africa?
Yes, it is a major point of interest for the U.S. military. And so while I was working Somalia, we had a lot of work with them there.
Hmm. I mean, mainly right now, it's drones that fly out of Djibouti in Somalia. Is that correct?
It's a lot of that, but we also have our, let's see, let me see if I can think of the acronym again. It's our Rapid Response Force is based there. After the attacks on our facilities in Benghazi, we put a permanent presence there that when the war broke out in South Sudan, we had 50, Army guys fly in from Djibouti rapidly in order to help us secure our facilities and our embassies. So we have this permanent presence there that's, in addition to the kinetic activity that's being conducted, we have that presence there that is meant to be able to rapidly deploy within that region if we have imminent security threats like we did in Juba when the war broke out.
And might I add Yemen, which is right across from the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and the Red Sea, why Djibouti is so heavy militarized. A lot of oil tanker traffic tries to go through there.
It's also, I mean, just a ton of traffic, a ton of trade occurs through there. I mean, if you shut that down, you shut down a massive percentage of global trade.
Exactly. But I was wondering, again, getting back to your training, I think you said, I've only had a chance to skim forward to reading it. But I think what you say is that, first of all, a lot of the officers that are young people that are sent into these danger zones are not well prepared. And I was just wondering, do you get, with regard to history and geopolitics and, the broader conflicts between nations, on that, or what?
That you cut out just a little bit at the end there, but yeah, in terms of the training that we get, we have the Foreign Service Institute. It's our training facility that's outside Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. And, we have an area studies class. We do a little bit of education in that, but it's certainly not in depth. Foreign Service officers are considered, you're basically hired for your ability to flex in different situations, adapt as needed, and really kind of, give yourself your own guidance. So, you do a lot of study on your own before you go out, but, I wouldn't say that we get anywhere near on the level of training, whether in area studies or leadership or basic management studies or any number of things as you get in, say, the military.
So is that part of your frustration, or what ultimately was your major frustration? You went in there with high ideals and you came out disillusioned.
Yeah, my major frustration was that our foreign policy was driven, more by inertia and short-term political views than long-term strategic goals based on values that we want to promote around the world. And I saw that in South Sudan. I saw our inability to flex and change in order to promote what would be in our long-term national security interests and in the long-term interest in that country. I think that we look at things like strong men in security situations, and we think, if you look back to the Arab Spring, there was all this concern about, change from autocrats. The problem is an autocratic government might seem stable in the near term, but it is not stable in the long term. And I feel as though our commitment to human rights and accountability is far too shallow. And this is not about what's morally right. It's about what is right in the long-term interest of stability and prosperity in the world, which is in our long-term interest too.
So I mentioned in the email to you that WILF has sections now in 14 African countries, which is kind of amazing. Our recent Secretary General is able to actually, I think, get large funding from the Scandinavian countries to promote, example, from Sweden to the Congo. And we recently held our first triennial Congress in Ghana. So I guess my question, I believe we have, and not South Sudan, but Sudan. My question is, you know, women's rights in Sudan and grassroots groups, did you feel that they had any power war or before or after?
So if you look, it's actually interesting to look at the counter between Sudan and South Sudan. Sudan has, as we saw last year with the protests in Sudan, Sudan has a pretty advanced civil society kind of organizations, civil society groups, professional groups and organizations. It's in many ways a lot more kind of advanced in terms of the ability of you know, kind of groups to throw their weight around. In South Sudan, most of civil society was really organized around churches and church groups, and that was where you saw the most activity. Civil society, in terms of kind of NGOs, you know, non-government organizations, peace groups, beyond the church realm were really, really not very well developed. There just wasn't much of a tradition of that. And where they were starting to develop, there was always a concern that they were somehow politically affiliated. So you didn't have a very robust sense of kind of independent, non-governmental organizations that were active on behalf of civilians in South Sudan. You know, I'll be honest, I'm not sure. I know different groups have begun in the last few years, and it's probably a little more advanced now, but because of how harsh the government has been against NGOs and peace groups, if you are not somehow affiliated with or protected by the government, you know, and if, let's say, you are critical of the government, it's a very dangerous place to be outspokenly critical of the government. So, you know, you continue to have, in terms of civil society organizations that are really active, many of them are based outside the country now.
If I may interrupt here briefly, Cheryl Spencer has had some questions, and I've opened up the mic so that you can.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because I'm Zoom is not acting very well, so I can't see anything. So, well, Eileen Kurskowski also had a question about how much influence women in South Sudan have on the situation there. And my question was about the ceasefire, the global ceasefire. You answered, Elizabeth, in the chat that the groups fighting there were not observing the global ceasefire that the UN had requested. And then you said the Americans aren't either. And my follow-up question was, and are you just talking about South Sudan where the Americans are not observing the global ceasefire, or are you actually talking more widely other countries where, and supposedly, you know, we signed on the 1st of July in the Security Council, we signed on to the global ceasefire. Could you fill us in a bit more? This is
Sure.
This is a topic we are asking our branches to concentrate on at the moment, is the global ceasefire, and what we as individuals might be able to do to get it extended. So anything you know about the global ceasefire would be very helpful. Thank you.
Well, you know, absolutely. I mean, and it's a good question. I will say at the outset, the South Sudanese kind of official parties to the conflict, you know, when you're talking about them, you're not talking about the full picture, because so many of these kind of official parties, the South Sudanese army and the opposition army, you know, they are those entities, and they are also bleed into other local groups and local armed groups. So it's very difficult. My guess right now is that, you know, you do have what's actually going on just even this week in South Sudan is you have a disarmament campaign in the state of WILPF, and they've gone in to try, as part of this peace agreement that is fragilely, barely hanging on right now, they're trying to take weapons out of civilians' hands. Understandably, civilians are not particularly excited about this because they do not believe that the government is in their interest. So you've had fighting just even this week in South Sudan between civilians, armed civilians, and the official state army. So the government would tell you that they're simply getting attacked in the process of something that is, appropriate state activity under the peace agreement. I imagine the civilians there might have something else to say about it. So I think it would be hard to defend this South Sudan's actions under the global ceasefire right now. But I am certain that they would assert that those are more or less policing activities and that they are not actually fighting. So you see, it's a lot harder to kind of pin it down. As for the U.S. is not militarily active in the fight in South Sudan, so they are not engaged there. But I mean, as we call it blithely, our kinetic activity around the world, our various counterterrorism activity is ongoing. I mean, it's ongoing in Somalia. It's ongoing in lots of parts of the world. I couldn't tell you anything official because we keep that hidden fairly well, but I do know that activity during this global ceasefire has continued in certain places, and that the U.S. military believes that our counterterrorism acts are somehow beyond the realm of that global ceasefire. As usual, the US government thinks itself special and an exception to otherwise global rules. So I think the global ceasefire is a wonderful thing to continue to try and push. It is a concrete point that people can get behind and around. And I think under the circumstances of this pandemic, you are seeing some groups. I mean, you've seen some positive reaction from even like the Taliban on this. And I think that that's, a positive footing from which to possibly seek some peace, even if temporarily, for different civilian populations that are affected.
Wonderful. Other questions, Cheryl, or others who are?
I got another question.
Oh, okay.
I just read. From the state boards were forced, that the people in the State Department were actually forced out. I think I read that, where was it, Wall Street Journal. Have you seen that? And if that's so, why? I guess that's it. Why?
Why not?
Why would the Trump administration fire a bunch of State Department people? That's my question.
No.
Well, technically speaking, with every new administration, every political appointee with every new administration has to offer their resignation. All of our ambassadors, political or career, officially offer their resignation when you have a new administration come in. It's standard fare, and some of them are replaced and others are not. A larger percentage than usual were kind of accepted and stepping down under the Trump administration. I think the bigger concern for me is the people who have been forced out due to how they've been treated. Less so, you're actually shown the door than you take kind of high level and upward moving folks who are on their ways to ambassadorship or deputy positions, and because the Trump administration found them troublesome or difficult or not loyal, they stuck them in basement offices to review FOIA requests. And to do other menial tasks that have to be done, but probably not by a career ambassador. So I think that was more of what happened. But there's been a real gutting of people deemed not loyal to the Trump administration, and there's always some element of distrust between the politicals and the careers. Really, under any administration, you saw this under Obama as well, but nothing on the scale that we've seen under the Trump administration. It really has been an attack. And if you're interested in that, there was a Senate Foreign Relations Committee panel about 2 weeks ago that I spoke on, and where they put out a really good report on all of the different attacks against the State Department and what needs to be done, to rebuild it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Eileen has a question. Eileen, I've opened you up here.
Oh, thank you. It's been answered. I was wondering what the women in South Sudan were doing to deal with the crises they're dealing with, the military, and I think it was addressed. Thank you.
I mean, unfortunately, and women's issues were a big focal point of what I did when I worked on when I was in South Sudan, and it is, I mean, it's an abysmal situation. You have some incredibly strong women who have been doing work in South Sudan, but it's dangerous, it's difficult, and they're constantly fighting for a seat at the table. And until peace agreements bring more of the affected populations in to the discussion, peace will only be temporary, and that's what we keep seeing with South Sudan.
Do you know whether genital mutilation is as prevalent in South Sudan, given its Christian population, than, for example, mutilation on young girls is still taking place in all that area of Africa?
Yeah, I mean, it's still an issue, but it's not as prevalent as it is in other countries, particularly where you have you know, kind of the strong influence of very conservative, you know, I mean, Somalia is a place where it's a big issue because of the conservative, kind of extremist Islamic views that some communities have. So it's an issue. It's an issue all across the region, but not as prevalent as in some other places.
Well, we're peppering you with all sorts of questions. I have one, which is, what is our real U.S. policy towards we're just bombing people, as I get it, by drone. I read a book, Dirty Wars by
Jeremy.
I think he documents a time in Somalia's recent history when the Shabab, a moderate version of the Shabab, took power, and actually the whole country of is united, and there was peace for, I don't know, 6 months. And I think the United States worked to undermine that government. What is our point in being there? It seems very. And what was it like to be in Somalia? Were you in Mogadishu, or what was that like compared to South Sudan?
Well, I mean, really both fascinating and interesting places to be. The hardest part of Somalia was that I was stuck on the kind of military base on the international airport compound because of security issues, and our focus on pouring so many resources into our military activity there made it really hard for us to do our diplomatic work. You know, as with all conflicts, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. But yes, you know, I would not say that all of Somalia was united behind. It was the Islamic Courts Union was kind of the predecessor from which the Shabab rolled out and became an extremist level. Now, the ICU was the Islamic Courts Union was able to provide things that had not been provided under the warlords who ruled after Siad Barre, who was the you know, dictator who was pushed out. And then you had a period of time run by warlords, and the ICU, the Islamic Courts Union, came in and was able to establish some security. They kind of set rules. They had courts. It was a harsh rule, but you kind of knew what the rules were, which is a really big part of communities having a sense of the legitimacy of who's governing them. But because they were Islamic at the time, the US government really didn't like that and did get involved in essentially trying to overthrow them. Now, I'm not going to say the ICU was just all full of good guys, but I will definitively say that our work to prop up kind of an externally driven government and pushing them out did certainly help lay the groundwork and build the extremism that then pushed al-Shabaab to being a major factor. Across the globe, our counterterrorism activities frequently foment terrorism. And that's one of my biggest concerns with what's going on in Somalia. Now, I will say that up until around, I'm going to get my years wrong around here, but I want to say it was up until maybe 2011 to around 2015 was kind of, you know, the heyday of the battle between the African Union mission which was a collection of governments in East Africa that worked to fight against al-Shabaab with support from the United States and others. So there was a lot of fighting going on there, but they did manage to push al-Shabaab out of Mogadishu and out of a lot of different areas. I will explain kinetic one moment. And so that there were some improvements. Al-Shabaab was pushed out of having a lot of territorial control, but we have been in a steady stalemate from basically 2015 or so to today. Not even a stalemate. I mean, al-Shabaab has started to get more influence, more ability to cause huge attacks both inside and outside the country. So it's not working. What we're doing is not working, and our military action has expanded. Kinetic activity, it's shorthand for airstrikes. It essentially means, you know, what we call our indirect activity in the country, which for several years was essentially directed at targeting, a kind of precision targeting of high value targets, you know, kind of high level members of al-Shabaab. And then it's been expanded to other different types of uses, such as protecting the Somali National Army when they're going in to do different attacks against al-Shabaab or trying to reclaim territory. It's a war. I mean, we're in an undeclared war in Somalia.
Yeah.
I have
We have just 5 more minutes here, so
Sandy's question to ask on her behalf, which is South Sudan aligned with Israel? Does it have an alliance with?
I don't think they have an official alliance with Israel. I mean, I will admit, actually, I mean, the Israelis are active there in different ways, but not very overtly and not in an official way that I am aware of. They're very active in the region, though, and they do sell weapons around the region, and they are involved in that way. So I will just admit that I couldn't tell you right now what their current status is, but they play a lot in the East African space.
Cheryl has asked in the chat, please explain the word kinetic.
That essentially means the drone strikes. It is all of our activity involving targeted drone strikes against, which is all part of our counterterrorism activities. It's a cleaner word than airstrike.
Okay, well, I'd like to bring up is about a positive event that's happened in Africa, which is the revolution in the Sudan, where the people overthrew the dictator of many decades. And so I'm wondering how that's.
We can't hear you, Robin.
And I hope people had the opportunity. I hope people had the opportunity to read the article in Toward Freedom, which is in Burlington, Vermont, that deals with grassroots movements around the world, and a very interesting article about that effort to after that, when the people tried to create the new alternative government after so many years of hardship. So I guess my question is just about, has those positive things happening in Sudan?
We lost you a little bit there, Robin, but I think I got the gist of the question. And I will say that was a great article to share. I encourage people to read it. It gave a really good overview of the status. That revolution was an incredibly inspiring one. And one thing that has happened since is that the US government has not really followed through in the way that we should be in order to promote the country getting to the next stage of civilian rule. That's a great example of a place where, the US government puts our finger on the scale in a lot of situations, and we can do that in South Sudan. We are right now. Unfortunately, we are for the most part, kind of helping reinforce the military side of it. So I would say it's an important lesson for us, which is one, civilians can, when they organize and come together, do a really good job you know, when they're determined, I mean, that was months and months of protests, and they were violent, and it was, I mean, there was violent pushback, and it was dangerous, but it did succeed in overthrowing a dictator. But the real work does really start after that with kind of building what comes next. And now you have these negotiations between a military side that has most of the resources and most of the power, and a civilian side that has, you know, public support, but not a lot else right now. And it needs the support of the international community behind it. So I would, you know, I'm hopeful that we will, particularly if we see a change in administration, see a real change and push in that direction, which is not to go in and reinforce the military and start being counterterrorism partners with Khartoum, but rather go in, help build institutions, and help, you know, build an opportunity for real civilian rule and accountability. So they're in a balance right now. It's really hanging in a balance, and the next, you know, 6 months to a year will be very telling in the direction that they go.
Okay, and in closing, I gather you're happy at Biden's choice of a vice president, because it seemed to me that Susan Rice was the likely other book fairly negative way. So how are you feeling about that?
I'm very happy that Susan Rice is not going to be the vice president. I'm very concerned she is going to be the Secretary of State. And I'm, you know, I mean, I'm continuing to write. I'm working on a piece now trying to push against, you know, for a better Biden policy in Somalia, if we get a chance, and a better overall Biden policy in Africa. My concern is that, you know, I'm all in for Biden. We've got to get rid of Trump, but I was not that wild about our foreign policy under the Obama administration. And I really hope that we are not just going to go back to 2016, but that we're going to go back to something that is better, less driven by the military, less driven by endless wars, more based on long-term kind of values and interests. So here's hoping.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that and your hope for the future. And, you know, keep track of WILPF, and maybe you can join us, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, in the future.